Hello again, friends. I'm gonna pick up the talk today from our original talk, the first episode around what happened, which is just sort of my telling the initial experience that was, again, unexpected and completely unsought after at that time. I believe I left off there getting to the end about just understanding that my preferences, as I previously had known them, all the pieces that made up my personality, had been reset, if you will. And it kind of gave an experiential meaning to the concept of being reborn, not necessarily in the way that we know it in the West as a born again Christian, but being reborn in the sense that the story that made up who you thought that you were and all the supporting behaviors that reinforced that story and that identity, whether you like it or not. I learned step by step that most of those had been reset. Reset in the sense that I still had desires and still have desires and still have joys and interests and passions, but they were completely realigned to a deeper truth that was not so much about my thinking mind around a decision of how do I want to spend my time, where do I want to spend my time, but more of a felt sense, a knowingness, again, talking about the transition going from the cognitive awareness of the thoughts of the mind and the brain to this somatic awareness and the wisdom of the body, which simply means that as you might subtly feel things in your body, if you knew that you were off of a path or if you're doing something that didn't feel aligned with your truth, there might be that discomfort. Imagine that feeling magnified times a million and it being completely pervasive. So every interaction, every thought, every conversation, you could totally live in this space at all times in an abiding way to know what was in full, partial, or no alignment with the truth of your being in your life. And in some ways, it sounds miraculous, miraculously joyful and positive. In other ways, it can be overwhelmingly disorienting, because who you thought you were, again, was supported by a number of behaviors, the millions of behaviors that we feel that we choose on a daily basis reinforce the story of who and what we are. So we kind of have this guiding identity. I am this, I am not that. I associate with this, I don't associate with that. However, those stories become something that we're attached to or we identify with, then the steps and sequence of the journey of our life are actions that reinforce that identity. And sometimes that's good and sometimes it's bad. Sometimes we're not sure. But that set of guiding thoughts, guiding stories, and then actions, that is the totality of the life in the physical world as we know it. So the example I gave, which I think is just one I enjoy sharing because it was so extreme, was when I came down into the kitchen that day and saw my mother right after that experience had happened, and she asked me, "What do you want for lunch?" And this is my first interaction with someone after that happening, and I wasn't quite sure exactly how the day was going to transpire from there after such a cataclysmic experience that morning. And I mentioned in the first podcast that what my response was that I didn't feel like eating meat today. And when those words came out of my mouth, it very much was an experience of me listening to words that I didn't feel like I was directing in the same way that I would have previously. It was like I was watching myself outside of myself to some extent. And my surprise and shock in that moment was, probably more heightened than my mother's, thinking that I just didn't feel like eating meat for lunch. But after that moment, the important thing there's two important parts to this. I've never touched another piece of meat. Actually, there's three important parts. I've never touched another piece of meat in my life. That decision wasn't based on a cognitive, ethical, moral debate that I came to a new conclusion on. It's something that, again, as a preference and a story that had been part of my life up to that time, it was no longer there. I was no longer eating meat as a behavior and activity that supported the story of how I needed to support myself nutritionally and societally. And the most important thing is that it wasn't ever hard. So I immediately became vegetarian, not because I desired to do it per se. It wasn't a desire. It just was the way that it happened. I had no resonance with meat, and I didn't hate people who ate meat, or I didn't necessarily feel judgmental about it. It's just no longer something that was supported by my life experience from that point forward. So I started as vegetarian, and so I was still eating cheese and milk initially. And I think because I just assumed, well, to go vegan seems like it'd be even harder. And it was about a year after that I decided to become vegan. No challenge, no problem. When I was 20, many years ago, I decided to try veganism for a month, and it was the most painful, difficult, hard thing. It was very difficult. And so this time, I never craved a cheeseburger. I never thought of bacon. I was never sitting in a dinner with friends and looking at the chicken on their plate and desiring that experience to eat that. So that is something that, in my mind, based on all my experiences in life to that time, would defy what I knew to be true, which was if I was going to make a choice to change a behavior that was deeply ingrained into my identity and who I was, it would take a long time. It would take a lot of perseverance and a lot of hard work. And this was, again, a reset of so many preferences. And I use that one because it can be an extreme one. I mean, people have deep attachments to food and to their rituals around food. I will say that at Thanksgiving and 4th of July, there was a loss of the ritual of being part of things that I had had my whole life. But that was more trying to rediscover how I relate to these dates and times and celebrations with groups of people who I loved and cared about. And that reoriented itself over time. Actually, with my mother becoming vegan and my brother becoming vegan, neither of who were vegan before that. And my family largely changing a lot of their eating behaviors, not because I asked them to. It's just what happened as life unfolded with this whole experience. So that's one example. Food is an important example, but it was everything related to my time, my energy, my passions, my joys. I realized that a lot of the stories I had that comprised my life and were supported by activities that I chose to do were stories I had societally been given, and I had chose to receive and reinforce in terms of what brought me joy and what was a conduit to experience happiness. And I don't know that as an abiding existence, I could have genuinely told you I knew what joy or happiness were as an abiding experience. It was always what you hear in most people's experiences, where I would do all of this work and spend all this time for like a brief moment of really just sort of distraction from from the norm, which I would have said, oh, this new experience is taking me outside of just this continuing condition of striving and seeking approval. This moment of acknowledgement, this must be joy, this must be happiness. And the key thing would be that it would be a moment, momentary. A momentary could mean a second, a minute, an hour. Probably not a full day. If it's truly every moment of a day, no, probably not. Not for anything, really. So I think a lot of the way that we can talk about sort of the key differences in these experiences is that there are some conditions in your life that could be experienced as abiding, meaning that peace and joy and happiness can be rediscovered, relearned, remet as your natural abiding condition, and not necessarily something that we have to work for or work toward or achieve, but that there's all this other stuff that's been layered on top of us that makes it difficult to get back to our truest, given, sovereign right to live, to be. And that very next day, so I went home, and not knowing kind of what would happen the next morning after that experience had just happened, really not knowing, going to bed thinking, okay, well, let's see what tomorrow brings. Well, tomorrow brought waking up crystal clear awareness at 3:30 a.m., on the dot. And much as I've described before, it wasn't so much like, none of this was a choice. So it wasn't like, oh, I meditated yesterday, so I feel like I should today, something good might happen. I couldn't not meditate. I couldn't not get out of bed. My energy was so high. It was so heightened, and I was so awake, but not in an anxious way. It was like I would sleep deeply, and then boom, right at 3:30, be awake. And my body would just sort of roll right out of bed and straight into a meditation. And those meditations were lasting from 1 to 3 hours. And it was a similar ongoing experience that during that period of time in my life, and it shifted and changed, slowly evolved over time. But that time was still me in this expansive energy field, really sort of exploring the expansiveness of my being and what I am, what you are, what we all are, in terms of being energy and light and infinity. And during that period of time, in retrospect, looking back on it now and looking at this through other phases of time, I would say that that was a deep, deep, deep recalibration and cleaning and clearing. And it wasn't that I would know that a certain amount of time would go by. It was like I would just have this knowingness that it was time to leave this experience. And every time during that period of time, every time when I would leave those experiences, whether I realized it or not during the meditation, which often I didn't, I would just have like tears had been streaming down my face. I'd have water dripping down my face. And my brain and my body, I can definitely tell you, felt as if they were changing on a daily basis. And the change was in a felt sense that all this weight, all these layers, all this complexity was being lifted off of me. It was being defragmented and taken away. And so I would just kind of come out of the meditation and, back into my living space. And it would take a while to transition into that because it was so dramatic in terms of that experience and going back and forth. My body, again, really, really, really hurt because, again, like I mentioned in the first one, if you're not sitting at all and you sit an hour, much less over an hour, your body generally needs time to work up to that. And so my body was just sort of screaming out to me like, you can't sit like this. Your hip joints, your legs, your knees, your ankles, they need time to become more flexible. And there's lots of exercises and practices you can do to create that flexibility, none of which I was aware of at that time. So initially, without those practices, I was just coming out of that incredibly slowly, and I was incredibly tender throughout my body. And it was like deeply painful, honestly. And like other stories that I've heard now in retrospect, much later than when I was having these experiences around spiritual awakening, so for the example, that next day after I've had this meditation and, like had this deep cleaning and like tears running down my face, I would start to get very drawn to the sun. And obviously, like, you were starting to meditate at 3 or 4, even in the summertime, the sun starts to come out at 5:36. So by the time that was done, I was very, very, very naturally drawn to like want to go see the sun. And I remember walking outside of the house that I lived in and looking at all of nature seemingly for the first time and crying, like a joyful cry, like crying out loud, but joyfully, looking at everything. And it was simultaneously a complete amazement and bewildering, overwhelming joy that everything was so incredibly beautiful on this earth. And also at the same time, a deep sadness that I felt like I had never been able to see it before now. So it's like a deep appreciation and wow, like how could I have been living for, almost 4 decades, and probably in my youth for sure, experiencing it this way. And then a long period of time went by in which I was surrounded by this completely incredible, blissful beauty of a world and an existence that I was not there. I was not present to fully receive the beauty of everything that surrounded me. So the draw to the sun was something that was incredibly palpable, because just like outdoors, the idea that there's this burning star in the sky that's just going to show up all of a sudden over the horizon. So I went and I live close to a large park here called Piedmont Park. So I find myself before sunlight, going out into the park, and I found like a nice quiet space where I could look at the horizon, and I would wait and wait and wait until like the very first peak of the first fractal of light would come over the horizon, and my heart would just explode with joy, because I'm like, look at this, it's amazing. Here we are moving at 26,000 miles per hour on this place we call Earth, and there's this burning star of light that ultimately the energy in which we're having this experience came from and comes from. And meanwhile, like, no one else is there noticing. We're doing everything else, but we're not there noticing this miracle every day of the sun. And we'll talk a lot about miracles throughout these chats. But, a miracle is a miracle until you decide that it's no longer miraculous. Like, that is the human experience. Like, we get to, by our own creativity and joy and emotion, compassion, all those things allow us to see the miracle of miracles, which they are. And likewise, the numbing of those abilities, the deprioritization of the magic, the deprioritization of spaciousness, the compartmentalization of pure creativity, all of those things take the miraculous and decidingly transform them into the mundane. So suddenly, all those things that I had through my own behavior, through socialization and my own choices made mundane, suddenly all those barriers and all that nonsense was erased. And I was surrounded by miracles that were always there, that they're here now, that only certain people choose to wear the glasses to see them, so to speak. So yeah, just waiting for the sun and then looking at it and crying, a lot of mornings, because it was just like unbridled joy. Like, that is what I am. Like, I am that. I'm that light. My existence is this relationship that I'm having with myself by looking at this miraculous star. It gives us everything. It gives us all energy on the earth. I don't know how that sounds to you. I don't know. There's a lot of playfulness that gets to return to life when we do these practices and when we allow these experiences to be real for us in our lives. And so the playfulness of life returned in a huge way, with a period before where playfulness, I had created it in such a way that it was not an option, in my life. And it was a beautiful transition to get back to the truthful nature of the play of life, of the joy, of the miracles. It's all one thing. You can't have the miracles without the playfulness. You can't have the playfulness without the joy. You can't have the joy without the freedom. You can't have the freedom without the practices to keep us rooted in the essence of truly who and what we are. So it's all connected in that sense. I would go through my day trying to learn what I did and didn't feel aligned to do. And I would do it by how I felt in my heart instead of the stories that I knew to be true. And that would be everything from reading certain books. I suddenly had a desire to want to play music and to be around devotional music that was being sung with that same energy of joyfulness and freedom and sovereignty that I'm talking about, like feeling music that carried that energy, that knowingness of everything that we've just talked about. And there was a lot of time, I've done another episode on, being alone versus feeling lonely. There's a lot more time alone because one of the greatest joys and miracle of this whole thing was, and is now, and it's completely abiding so far, is that for the first time in my life, I could close my eyes and be quiet, and I was completely surrounded by what I experience as unconditional love. And I never had anything like that. And maybe it was always there. I wish I always kind of wish now that I could go back, like get back into that previous experience of life to be like, what? How would I not feel this? How would I miss it? How would I not be able to connect with something that's so palpable and so, again, the word being inviting and pervasive and always there. So was it there and I didn't notice it? Or was it not there in that way? I don't know, but I know that I was not aware of any of this level of experience before that time. So to be alone, which of course, as I mentioned before, is completely impossible after these practices and this experience, but to be without other people and without other distractions, trying to keep your consciousness, going through the mouse wheel to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. Suddenly to have spaciousness and quiet, it wasn't a dry experience. It's not a dry experience. It was, oh my gosh, my entire being is love. And you can just sit in that existence for a long period of time without any need for anything else, without any desire for any distraction from the beauty of the essence of what you are. And as we've talked about before, most of the sickness in the world is the longing for distraction because we are not in connection with this deep, abiding, perpetual sense of the truth of what we are. And so as long as we remain unable to connect or disconnected from this, it's a perpetual seeking of something else, always something else, always something else, not what's here now as it is, pure in the raw, just your being, your absolute existence. It's like absolutely not that. It's any number of other things beyond the truth of that. So suddenly that truth was the most delicious, enjoyable, and describable until you've felt it, experienced, to just know and to abide in the fact that you exist as love, to feel it all throughout your body all the time, simply by closing your eyes. And you could be anywhere. You don't have to be on top of a quiet mountain. Well, that's wonderful. You could be in the subway in New York. You could be in jail. You could be any number of situations that we would have told ourselves the story are not desirable. And to have that abiding, pervasive existence as unconditional love and not needing anything else. That's a big part of it. It's not that you're not even trying to distract yourself, is you don't feel like you need anything else. Oftentimes, everything that we're pursuing, we're trying to achieve and prove, is longing to get that next serotonin hit, that next bit of endorphins, as I mentioned earlier, like that moment, that fraction of a moment, maybe at best an hour, maybe, probably a minute or two, and then it would go back to that lower baseline. And then of course it was like, well, what else can I do? I've got to win someone's affection. I've got to take a substance. I've got to whatever it is. And then suddenly none of that's necessary. To just be was more than enough, is more than enough. And if you're listening to this thinking that's impossible, all I can offer is the truth. I would have no other reason to share this other than to say that there is a way to exist in this world as the truth of who and what you are, which is, my choice of articulation is love, but it might be abiding peace. It might just be abiding connection. But there is an abiding experience that is the true nature and essence of being alive as a spirit in a human body. And that's really why I'm doing these talks. It's not just to say, hey, look, this is so great, this thing, whatever it is. It's saying that through a set of practices and through intention, layers of this experience can be realized and are very accessible. And that's really what I do with the sadhana practice, is try to listen to everyone where they're at on their journey and understand, so that we can work together for you to get closer to this abiding sense of complete peace and joy and love. Socialization was really hard. I realized that a lot of take the people's names out of it, the way I had constructed social life and friendship was primarily to satisfy my ego in lots of ways, where, the time spent with people on an individual basis, the quality was very low. And so it was more of a numbers game. Like, how many people would I be hanging out with? If I was never by myself, it meant that more people were drawn to me. Or if I could get more people to come to something that I was offering, well, that just spoke to my influence and how wonderful I was. And even though that's not how I would have thought about it exactly in those terms, in retrospect, looking at it, it's very clear that was, again, the same search for some kind of affirmation that I was important, or I was good, or I was pretty, or I was desired, whatever that word may be, fill in the blank. It could be anything. And so when I went back to the people that I was spending time with, most of them, the vast majority, like in my heart, I could see it for what it was. And no judgment on the people individually. It was more of behaviors in which I was interacting with them. And so I couldn't do that in that way because, again, it was felt so strongly in my body and my heart that I would say it was not a choice. And so all of my previous social behaviors immediately changed. So think about it, it's like food, diet, how I'm spending my time. Now I'm doing hours of meditation, I'm reading, I'm listening to devotional music. My social behaviors on weekends have changed. So those are most of the things that identify you in human life outside of work. And so my work, as I mentioned, I was wrapping up a startup that I had been working on for 6+ years, which ultimately was a blessing because the investors had left when they couldn't get their numbers to work the way they needed them to. And so we just had, a client or two that were left on their contracts or paying small amounts of money as I was trying to shut down that company because we had a team in India and the UK and the US. It wasn't just like a small LLC where the next day you could just sort of close it up. There was a lot of things that had to be done, and it took about a year to get those done properly in those countries. So that was really what I was doing, which before this experience would have seemed frustrating. After this experience was a complete blessing from the universe because although it wasn't very much money, it was enough money for me to do all the things that I promised to do to shut down the company properly. And at the same time, it still gave me a lot of needed spaciousness to re-know myself, to relearn how I could be and live in this life. The next podcast, we're going to talk about what really happened after this period of time. So about a year, there's a series of experiences that led me to spend time in Encinitas in California and travel to India, and ultimately getting to meet Ram Dass while he was in his body, which opened up a whole nother chapter of my life. So we'll save that for another podcast. But this is to really just talk about what life was like after that period of time, immediately following that experience. And again, in summary, I would say the biggest thing was I no longer knew who I was. I knew who I was by my name and my social security number and address and all those things. But all the activities that make a life, all the stories that make a life, those were being rediscovered one by one. And as I would find my things I was aligned with, it was immediate knowingness and so much joy and so much fun and so much excitement. But the key thing here is that nothing happened gradually. This was not a slow transition that happened over days or weeks or months or a year. Everything had happened instantaneously from that experience that I talked through in the first episode. So there was a bit of disorientation, and I had no spiritual friends. So overtly spiritual friends that were practicing things and on various paths or parts of communities. So that was a whole learning process to figure that out, which I'll also leave that for the next chat that we have. But I just had to trust the truth of my heart. And for the first time in my life, without any doubt, I knew that. So although I would say everything was scary, for sure, because again, I was still trying to learn by primarily reading, about spiritual awakening and the phases of it and what may or may not happen or how it might be experienced. So scary in that sense, but also completely comforting to be living in my heart again, probably for the first time since I was 6 or 7 or 8, where I was following my intuition. I knew that I had the right to follow my intuition and to believe in the truth of my heart, that was not a privilege. That was why I was alive. Clearly understanding that in this incarnation, the reason I was alive was to follow the truth of my heart. And to know that truth was pure and grounded and maybe not understood fully by my mind, but deeply, deeply, deeply trusted, which has really led to all of the things I've done in my life since then. So I think that's a good stopping point for today. And again, I would just offer that all of us, to some extent in this moment, can feel into our heart and to the truth of our heart. We talk about it theoretically and Hallmark cards and in media and stuff, but the truth is that that's actually the truth. And so really the practice and the process, regardless of it's some flip of a light switch like what happened with me, or if it's methodical dedication and commitment to listening to truth a little more, following truth a little more, allowing these layers of compartmentalization and this heaviness that's been placed on you for the entirety of the life that you can remember, letting pieces of that go, letting the stories go, letting the false obligations and false responsibilities go. Trust, 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 courage, courage, courage. Not because someone told you, but because as you listen to your heart, you can test all of this. So you listen to your heart, you do practices, and you move in a direction. You allow life to move through you. You allow life to move through you in a direction. So you're not necessarily doing it in the way that you would have thought that you're doing it. You're surrendering the energy of your life to move through you in a direction that's guided by your heart. And as you allow this, you get to see how the universe is working with you and responding or not. That's the beauty of this. There's nothing to believe. This is not about belief. This is the opposite. Courage is an experiential thing. Courage is a reaffirmation by life to you that the knowingness of your heart is in fact the true direction. So you build courage over time by listening and by allowing to life work through you. And the more courage you have, the bigger your heart can be, and the more listening you can do to it, and the more free you become to allow this incarnation to be the greatest, deepest, most meaningful thing that's possible. And the bounds of that are quite infinite, I promise. Let's stop there for today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing this journey with me and this experience. I'm grateful for your courage, just for being here and listening, taking part. Thank you.